Bonjour à tous, merci d'être ici avec nous ce soir à l'occasion de l'ouverture de l'exposition Bâtir des lois, To Build Laws. So I'm very happy to see so many people here. Mais avant de commencer cet événement, donc je me présente, je suis Émilie Rotaillot, je suis conservatrice publique ici au CCA. So my name is Émilie Rotaillot, I'm curator public here at CCA. Et je voudrais commencer cet événement en reconnaissant que les peuples autochtones Ganyengeaga de Ganawage, Ganasadage et Aguasasne ont des connexions de longue date avec Tiohtià:ke, Munyang, Montréal. Leurs ancêtres, tout comme ceux des communautés Wendat, Anishinaabe et Abénaki, vivaient sur ces terres bien avant l'arrivée des colons. Aujourd'hui encore, l'île abrite de nombreuses personnes issues des Premières Nations, Inuits et peuples métis. Ces communautés continuent de subir la remise en cause de leurs droits et l'érosion de leurs territoires traditionnels, provoqués par les mécanismes du colonialisme d'implantation, système qui persiste encore de nos jours. Le CCA étant établi sur des territoires qui n'ont jamais été cédés par leur population autochtone, nous reconnaissons donc les racines coloniales de notre institution et nous nous engageons à favoriser des relations inclusives et positives avec les nations autochtones de Tiohtià:ke, Munyang, Montréal et d'ailleurs. Notre engagement comprend des programmes publics, des résidences de recherche et de création, des collaborations qui ont pour objectif de créer un processus de reconnaissance territoriale vivant, ainsi que d'offrir un soutien, de partager des ressources sur du long terme avec les communautés autochtones et les chercheurs. Si vous voulez en savoir plus, je vous invite à aller consulter notre site internet. Ce soir, donc, je suis très heureuse de vous accueillir pour cette présentation, donc à l'occasion du vernissage de notre exposition et de notre nouveau film, Bâtir des lois, To Build Law. Cette exposition a été commissariée par Francesco Garutti, directeur associé programme ici au CCA, et il présente le travail des collectifs d'architectes allemands bplus, de leur plateforme de recherche et d'enseignement CS+, Station Plus, et de leur restante initiative HouseEurope. C'est avec ce soir Olaf Grawert, membre de bplus, et Alina Kolar, qui est gestionnaire de campagne de l'initiative HouseEurope, qu'on va pouvoir aussi en savoir plus sur leur travail en général et sur leur nouveau projet et leur nouvelle initiative HouseEurope. Ils vont nous présenter en fait la façon dont ils développent différentes formes d'engagement en fait envers des questions de la réutilisation adaptative et les valeurs sociales, écologiques et culturelles qui sont portées à travers les bâtiments existants. Nous parlerons donc également de leur récente initiative, donc qui s'appelle HouseEurope, qui est en fait un laboratoire politique lab, qui a été fondé par bplus et qui a de nombreux partenaires européens et dont le but est de proposer des réformes dans le secteur de la construction et de l'architecture, de soutenir des changements culturels afin de faire connaître la rénovation et la réutilisation adaptative du bâti existant, de les faire reconnaître en tant que nouvelle forme, nouvelle norme à l'échelle européenne. J'aimerais aussi attirer votre attention sur le fait que cette exposition et ce film que nous ouvrons ce soir, c'est le deuxième chapitre de notre initiative sur le terrain, Groundwork, qui s'intéresse aux projets alternatifs et aux recherches menées sur le terrain par des architectes en réponse aux crises sociales et environnementales qui touchent notre environnement bâti et naturel aujourd'hui. Ce projet s'accompagne d'une série d'articles thématiques en ligne qui s'appelle Les forces de friction, d'une publication qui est en préparation, de conférences, de discussions, de visites. Donc j'en profite aussi pour vous inviter à revenir demain à 18h pour assister à une discussion plus intime, on va dire, qui aura lieu dans la maison Shaughnessy, qui s'appelle « Détruire ou réparer les alternatives autour de nous », en présence de nos invités de ce soir et d'autres architectes aussi canadiens invités, Alexandre Landry, Conrad Specker, Juliette Cook, pour faire le point et discuter, confronter aussi les enjeux économiques, environnementaux et légaux autour de la rénovation au Canada. Ce soir, la présentation se déroulera en anglais. Elle sera filmée et sera mise en ligne dans quelques semaines sur notre site internet et sur notre chaîne YouTube. On gardera un moment à la fin des présentations pour des questions, en fait, si vous en avez, bien sûr, en anglais ou en français. Avant de laisser la parole justement à Olaf et Alina, je voudrais inviter Francesco Garutti, qui est directeur associé au programme donc en CCA, donc le commissaire de cette exposition et du projet en fait sur le terrain Groundwork, à venir sur scène nous expliquer brièvement sa vision du projet et son développement. Merci.
Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci Émilie. Je suis très heureux de pouvoir présenter ce soir Bâtir des lois, la deuxième chapitre de la série sur les terrains ici au CCA. Et j'aimerais commencer par remercier tous ceux qui ont travaillé sur la conception et la réalisation de ces projets. Toutes les équipes de conservation, de numérique, de production et de projets de scénographie ici au CCA. Et encore Annette Lux et Alina Kolar, les graphistes de projet, Joshua Frank, le directeur cinématographique de la série, Iris Singh, directrice de la photographie ici avec nous ce soir, et Kayla Fragman, qui a travaillé sur le montage du film. Merci à Giovanna Borasi, qui a cru en ce projet dès le début, et à Madame Lambert pour avoir fondé une institution tournée vers l'expérimentation de nouveaux formats de recherche et qui s'intéresse toujours à la lecture critique des forces qui structurent l'environnement bâti contemporain. Et bien sûr, à le collectif bplus, Alina Kolar et Olaf Grawert, les protagonistes de ce deuxième épisode de la série. At the CCA, we always start a project with a question. So how do we really understand the making of architecture in the age of ecological crisis? The question is, of course, broad and challenging is the answer, but implies several other reflections and considerations. We are living in an age of a speculative system designed to favor profit over people. We are living in a moment in which the capacity of the architect to be a real agent shaping space is more and more swallowed up by the dominant logic of the neoliberal urbanism and its suffocating speculative rules. So we are as well facing social crisis undermining the most basic conditions of living, while ecological collapses actually are threatening the existence of a multiplicity of human and non-human beings across territories and geographies. So, in a sort of a kind of a way, questions of whether or not to build or how to intervene and what to do with the existing building stocks are at the core of architectural thought, we think. So what's the role of the architect in the age of ecological crisis? In the last 10 years, I would say, somehow after the stipulation of the Paris Agreement in 2015, conspicuous number of exhibitions, biennials, curatorial projects tackling issues directly connected with climate change, the values of climate justice, have been populating the space of architecture institutions across the world. And the world of architecture is somehow united to face, raise awareness, and trigger a debate about one of the most problematic issues of our time, and it's working to make it a public concern. At CCA, guided by the urgency to understand the structural and fundamental ways that architects are enacting, in order to kind of change a way of dealing with the built environment, we decided to shift our approach, really to try to better understand. With the Groundwork series, instead of reporting on the result of project, we decided to try to document design during its nascent stage. So Groundwork deliberately observes when ideas, rather than building, take shape. It seeks to witness conceptual responses to context and conditions, political and economic constraints, cultural and geographical transformations. So the detours, the failures, discoveries, tactical shifts becoming revelatory moments to understand new modes of practice and critical ways of engaging with given sites and communities. So this is important not to report what has happened already, but we've been following the desire of narrating a series of stories about thinking processes and potential ideas taking shape now. So to address this key structural question, we decided to engage in dialogue with three practices active in very diverse contexts in the world who are developing methodological approaches that aim to question, subvert, and redefine what it means making space today. The first chapter of the stories, and here you see the posters of the three documentaries, the two actually, plus one coming soon, we are developing. And the first chapter of the story has been following the architect Xu Tiantian in Meizu Island off the coast of China, where she's creating a set of subtle intervention to mediate between pressure of heritage, tourism, and marine ecology. The second chapter of the series, which is of course what we are opening tonight, focuses on the collective of architects and activists, bplus, in Berlin, Germany, as they launch this European Citizens Initiative intended to shift culture and legislation toward preservation and rehabilitation of existing buildings, offering a way to actively fight forms of inequitable urban speculation. Finally, the series will conclude next June, following Carla Joaçaba, a Brazilian architect able to somehow develop a research in the earth of Minas Gerais in Brazil, where she's developing a set of light pavilions in a coffee field. So sort of minimal support structures in a territory where collectives are resisting the dominant extractive industrial agriculture. So, as you probably know, at the CCA, we've been concerned, about complicated relationship of architecture with the environment since several years. But with this project, we tried to reverse somehow a little bit our methodological approach we were used to apply to this type of kind of investigation of contemporary practices. So we decided really to meet the architect directly on the ground. What you see here are some of the stills of Chapter 1, Into the Island, the film which has been following Xu Tiantian in Meizu Island, as you've seen, doing scouting of the site, encountering, the communities, developing, a project in dialogue with the engineers, starting, construction and, different type of assessments of the conditions of the ground, following the locals, debating, potential options for, this form of self-care for the land that she's developing there. We've been meeting on the ground the bplus collective. This is Olaf Grawert, actually in his hotel in Zurich. In this moment, is on a Zoom call with Alina Kolar and Anu Brandhuber. They are basically debriefing after a meeting with the marketing strategist. Here is in their office in Berlin, during one of the initial meetings to launch the campaign. Or at the faculty at the ATH in Zurich, where somehow also the relationship, with the students, the S+ station has been at the core of the project. This is an image from Brazil, Carla Joaçaba, Minas Gerais, the first kind of a sampling of the soil, of the ground. This is an image that Carla took for us. And kind of other ongoing kind of research that are happening while we are talking now in these days and will be the subject of the third film. These are actually WhatsApp videos that the client of Carla has been sending us in order to update us during the research. So in order to kind of follow in the best way the phases through which an idea of a project is taking shape, we decided to use cinema as one of the essential operative tools to understand the flow of thoughts and the ongoing relationship between an author and the site. Joshua Frank, journalist and filmmaker based in Montreal, has started working with us documenting encounters, meetings, working sessions, site visits with 3 offices to assemble 3 very different stories of 3 very different ways of rethinking architecture making today. In the gallery of the CCA tonight, you will encounter a film shot in Europe across March and October 2024 between Berlin, Zurich, and Basel, documenting closely the bplus team during the various phases of conceptualization, discussion, and development of the HouseEurope initiative. So as we mentioned already, HouseEurope is actually a European citizen initiative to propose new laws through direct democracy and signature collection. So catalyzing a shift away from demolition and new building development toward renovation and adaptive reuse as the new norm. Our film and exhibition tonight are narrating the story of a political campaign developed by space makers. A story about how a group of architects is trying to redefine the legal terrain within which it will be possible, we hope, to operate tomorrow. A story that Alina and Olaf will tell us in a moment. But now please allow me to introduce them and welcoming them on stage. So Alina Kolar is a recurring collaborator of bplus on the project HouseEurope and Station Plus. She's a communication scientist, creative strategist, and curator specializing in visual culture and political semiotics. She works at the intersection of art, activism, and social change, with a particular focus on visuality of public events and representation of public. An expert in diverse, inclusive management across organizations, Alina has built global partnership and has been acting as special consultant to move fluidly through the public and the private creative sectors. Between 2017 and 2022, she co-founded and led the international street newspaper, publishing house, and philanthropic organization, Arts of the Working Class. Alina Kolar is researching and teaching at the ATH with Station Plus since 2023. Olaf Grawert is architect, advisor, and partner at bplus in Berlin. Together with a close network of collaborators, he works on architectural projects that bridge theory and practice, from campaigns and exhibitions to publications and films. His work focuses on the political and economic conditions of spatial production, with a particular interest in the potential of architecture to affect social change. Grawert was co-curator of 2038, The New Serenity. This is the title of the German pavilion at the 17th Venice Biennale, and he's co-editor of What is Architecture. And he's been teaching with Station Plus at ATH Zurich since 2017. So please join me in welcoming on stage Alina Kolar and Olaf Grawert. Thank you.
Okay. So I will start, and then Alina, we have a switch in between. Thank you very much. I already said it yesterday. For us, this is, of course, fantastic in all our entities and roles to be here, but particularly as HouseEurope, of course, because getting this stage and getting this attention will, of course, help the initiative to spread. And we already learned that so many people in Canada also have a European passport. And so you can actually also sign for the initiative when it starts. The title of the lecture is A Question of Value, and this is something that will come up again and again in the presentation, also in the various short videos that you will see. This question of how do we value certain things and why other things don't have a value, and is it like value or is it the price? This is kind of like the question. Francesco already introduced it, and I want to introduce it briefly again. We work in different entities. No, we have these three entities in which we operate. One is bplus as an architectural practice. It is a practice that focuses completely on adaptive reuse, as architects say, no? On the renovation and transformation of existing buildings. You already see here some examples, and I will show two examples of our build work also in the presentation to give you more context. I mean, in general, this kind of like lecture input should be along the exhibition you see up there. So there are many elements that you will see and hear now about, and that you can then find upstairs and maybe also dive in deeper. As a practice, we also reorganized ourselves. The office is a continuation of Brandlhuber Plus, which is an office that was opened by Arno Brandlhuber. We are now 4 partners at the moment, and we are now operating also as a cooperative, like equal shareholders, because at a certain point we also said, okay, we have to also adapt and reuse kind of like our office. We are also teaching, as Francesco mentioned, as Station Plus at ETH Zurich. There we are the chair for architecture and storytelling. So since 2017, we actually ask students to work with time-based media. The idea is not that we say to students they should all become filmmakers, but doing these videos and telling these stories is really important to kind of like also make students realize it's not only about or on the design of buildings in plans and models, but that every project basically needs a narrative and a story to actually convince the people out there why change is needed or how we can achieve it. And the third entity is HouseEurope. And HouseEurope is both a non-profit, like we founded a non-profit for it. And as a non-profit, we are a policy lab, so a group of people who try to come up with new legislation, but it is also the title of the European Citizens Initiative that Alina will then present after kind of like the input on the build work. And in between you always have these short films, so we start with the first video and film.
Work hard, be happy, work more, take care of yourself. Work harder, care less, earn money, don't speak about it. Architects are in high demand. Construction is flourishing, nominal wages are rising. Students get hired straight out of university. Statistically, we have rarely been better off. So why are we so unhappy? Architects have made a pact, low wages for creative freedom and fulfillment. But right now, this fulfillment is gone, as the deregulated market does not allow architecture to live up to its social aspiration, as the destructive consequences of architecture have become undeniable, as the architectural practice has become a financial instrument and an asset itself, between exploitation and extraction. We cannot ignore our influence on society. We cannot deny our impact on this planet. We cannot reduce our practice to wage labor. We cannot become voluntary prisoners of unfulfilling work. Instead, we need to focus on the social meaning of labor by confronting ourselves with the tasks of building, by conceptualizing our everyday work as political, by prioritizing, negotiating and persuading, by collaborating, joining forces, sharing resources. Quiet quitting is not the answer, loud dedication is. We cannot believe in the lonely genius. Work itself must be revolutionized, so that we may commit to architecture once again, the business of architecture.
So this was the trailer for the publication you saw in the end, our collaborative issue with Arc Plus magazine, The Business of Architecture. And kind of like the core question, and I used this quote by Saskia Hebert, who is an architect and transformation scientist from Berlin, is this question, or this kind of like statement, that the greatest challenge for us as architects today is to create a self-sustaining practice in times of post-growth. So what we heard before, we are all aware of the ecological crisis. Still, we want to practice as architects. What does it mean, and how can we as architects build a practice that is actually not longer part of the problem, but tries to kind of like be part of the solution or deliver certain answers. And why did we do this issue, or how did it happen? Basically, it was this very interesting moment where we as practitioners teaching at ETH were confronted with this reality, actually of the same number, 38%, but on the one side it stands for the growth of the building industry and architectural market in Europe, whereas on the other side it stands for the CO2 emissions. And we as practitioners are kind of like operating in this growth logic, but then on the other side we were confronted by the students who also started literally kind of like a protest. No, they said we can no longer only design new buildings because we are complicit in the system. And we said, okay, how can we kind of like negotiate or understand this conflict in a way that all of us as practitioners are part of this one logic, whereas the students are totally aware that we have to change and shift. So how can we actually redesign our practice? And this is something that for us as a practice focusing on adaptive reuse is maybe then in that sense kind of like obvious or easy, because we were already operating in this renovation market or in this market of existing buildings. And when we take a look on the numbers, or like in the numbers of the European market, and all of these numbers are coming from the European sector studies, so every second year the Architecture Council of Europe presents these numbers, how Europe is developing the architectural market. We see that already today it's like 50-50%. So already 50% of the market are actually coming from existing buildings, or kind of like the economies within the existing, and only 50% are new, and then you have different numbers for the different countries. And actually Italy, sometimes we give lectures in Italy and we say learning from Italy. Italy is the market or the country where you have already most of the market focusing on the existing, on renovation and transformation. And this was really important for us to understand why is this happening already in certain countries and not in all of them. If you zoom out, then you realize that today 25% of the European building stock is already renovated and 75% is not yet renovated, and that we annually renovate right now 1% of the building stock. So we have a very low renovation rate, only 1% per year. And this is particularly interesting when you think of the goals that we basically agreed, as a European Union, as all the European countries, because we all agreed to decarbonize the European building stock until 2050. So actually we only have 25 years left to renovate all of Europe's building, but we just learned that 75% are not renovated yet, and we only renovate 1% a year. So there's this very simple conclusion that only 25% are renovated, 75% are still open or need to be renovated. When we renovate with 1%, it would take us 75 years. And we only have these 25 years, so to us it's very clear that we have to triple the renovation rate. This is also what the European Union says, which is of course a fantastic moment also to speak to the students who are sometimes overwhelmed and don't know in which direction the market is developing or the practice is developing, because it makes clear that this market is something that we have to incentivize and open for the future. But then of course it's not only facts and numbers, and we spoke about also yesterday at the pre-opening a lot. It's also this question, how do you not only design the thing like the object, but also the advent of its idea into culture? Because it's not only the facts, it's not only the building, it's also the narrative and this idea that we want something or need something. And I will show now again a trailer.
From France to the Philippines, from Jamaica to Japan, from Malaysia to Mexico, from Sri Lanka to Singapore, privatization is on the move.
Something new had been born. Its name was popular capitalism.
Popular capitalism is nothing less than a crusade to enfranchise the many in the economic life of the nation. We conservatives are returning power to the people. That is the way to one nation, one people.
Political means, are you right or you left? Or it means, are you blue or you're green or whatever it is. And so it has already a kind of a negative or not a human face. And I can't change the word, but I think, how can you change it? How can you, maybe you have to go and say, instead of use the word, which is a problem with so many key words, and say what you mean.
Some of the greatest changes to the globalizing world are being written in the language of architecture and urbanism. So there has to be a chance that we know something about it. And I'm sure that we, more than the 28-year-old McKinsey consultant who's making most of the global decisions, I'm sure that we know. So without leaving behind our fundamental forms of education, trying to bring those along to think about another kind of form making which gets us closer to that, and also changing narratives, understanding what makes changes contagious in persuasions and in discrepant messages and so on. It seems to me that there isn't any chance that spatial change we want to make is going to be made unless we can not only design the thing, but design the advent of that idea into culture.
Something that I learned during this year is storytelling. Storytelling. The risk of a technocratic government is that in the way you communicate, you easily fall into into a too specialized discourse, too technical, too difficult to understand, too detailed. You miss the point, and you should make a story.
Okay. This was the trailer of Architecting After Politics. I mean, the trailer is also in the show. You can watch it again. Film is online. I want to take one quote from it by Oana Bogdan, who is an architect and former politician. She's also one of our ambassadors and national partners from Belgium. And this idea that facts are no longer enough to really convince people, but we have to tell a story. I think that's really important. It's part of many discussions that we have, that it's not only about all the facts that we can present, that are present also in our films, but how can we actually introduce a narrative that more people want this change and see the need for the change. And in that sense, in the trailer, you have these two very strong figures. No, on one side, Margaret Thatcher, who came up with fantastic terms, no matter if we agree politically or not, like popular capitalism, that were so powerful and so strong in convincing the wider public. And on the other side, architect and writer Keller Easterling, who says, okay, we as architects, it's not about leaving behind our skills and the way we are trained, but we have to add, of course, this capacity to change narratives or also design these narratives. And from her was the quote before, how can we design this advent of an idea into culture. And I want to present or show you how we do this actually in our build work, which then I think leads to why we started doing HouseEurope as an initiative. And I want to show you two projects. The first one, San Gimignano Lichtenberg, is also part of the exhibition, and I want to kind of like introduce you to the context and show you basically, it's like a journey to the project. So this is what you would see, or what you see when you arrive there by public transport. You are basically greeted by the sign which says Dong Xuan Center. And the Dong Xuan Center is this big Vietnamese wholesale market. So it's all these warehouses that you can see here, this one-story high warehouses. You see the towers already in the back. And it's important to understand that these warehouses, they're the biggest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam, and they were completely built after the wall came down by these Vietnamese guest workers to sell their goods. And what was there before, until the wall came down in GDR, there was this gigantic factory, and you see the towers in between. And when the wall came down, this factory fell out of use, as many factories and buildings in GDR territory, and basically sat there as a ruin. And we have these before and after images, and then you also already see better the context, so you really have these warehouses everywhere. So we have these two towers. This is the silo tower on the one side, and this is the staircase tower on the other side. So these both towers were basically really only serving this gigantic factory, and are still sitting there as a ruin. So in 2010, the factory was then actually cut into pieces and sold for the material value. That's also an interesting learning. So in 2010, after the financial crisis, the material prices went up. So till 2010, it made no sense to demolish the factory. Then after the financial crisis, all by a sudden the prices went up, and you could basically earn money by cutting the factory into pieces and selling it. Kind of like a similar situation as we see it the last years, where the value of material changes. And these warehouses, they kind of like grew, getting closer and closer to the two towers. And today we have the situation where these two buildings are really sitting on this very small piece of land. So basically the piece of land of the two towers is the minimum size it can have because of legal reasons, no? And these towers were sitting there. Why? Because no one saw a value in these towers. And basically it's always the same calculation. You have the market price, no? The buildings were offered on the market, and everyone calculated that you have to demolish them. So you would buy the towers, you would have to pay to demolish them, which then kind of like leads to the empty land. So it's the resulting land price. You would build something on top, and then there would be this calculation, does it pay off, yes or no? And then it's really interesting because it's a question of perception, that in this area, no one could imagine something else. So everyone said it can only be one-story high warehouses. It makes no sense to invest so much money in the demolition to build one-story high warehouses. And that's really the reason why for a long time these buildings were actually considered a ruin. And that's really always an interesting moment when you see a ruin like this. Who agreed that this is a ruin? No? Because you could also say on the other side, we see the huge potential in these existing structures. And that's actually what we then as a practice did. We said, okay, how can we activate the potential that we see in there? And this is when actually the storytelling came in. So the project is called San Gimignano Lichtenberg. This is San Gimignano, a village in Italy which is very famous for its high towers. No? So that was the idea. Can we basically borrow the perception, the image, the narrative of this very positive place that actually everyone likes and knows for these towers, and kind of like borrow it for our own project and introduce this other story. So in that sense, the first architectural intervention was not a building, but the first intervention was to create this artificial hill. So there was a construction site close by. Christopher Roth, who is one of the people who kind of like started this project, went there and said, can we basically take the leftovers, the rubble and the earth, and bring it to our site and create this hill. The hill looks very small now, but actually it's quite big when you're on there. And this really was the starting point for a storytelling or for a narrative that we could introduce and then start communicating. So this is like a lifestyle supplement to one of the biggest German newspapers, which is of course a fantastic moment because people don't buy an architectural magazine, it basically arrives at home with them. And on the cover you had this tower and it says Schöner Wohnen, which is more beautiful living or beautifully living in a way. And this question, what is the future of the city, or what is the future of buildings like this, or this building in particular? And that led to a series of articles and moments when we had the chance to speak about the project, about the idea of reinterpreting it, but also changing the narrative of a place that after the wall came down and after the factory fell out of use, for many people was a symbol of failure. No, people didn't want these buildings, and it's also something we can speak about when we speak about HouseEurope. There's certain heritage that people would like to demolish, but how can you actually change this meaning and introduce another one? So I will briefly present how we kind of like renovated one of the towers. So the silo tower is now converted in our prototyping workshop, where also we relocated as a studio. We opened there a workshop with many other designers and parties where we work. So actually what you can see that all the openings are existing openings. The interventions are in that sense minimal. These are the only plans I will show. So you see a 3D scan on one side where you can understand the structure with these silos, and then on the other side what we did as an intervention, you have the plans also in the show upstairs. So we actually only built 2 additional slabs to create these 2 spaces. One warm space in the ground floor and one warm space in the first floor. So these are the before and after images. I think we have a question moment afterwards, then we can speak about details if one wants. But other than that, it's really about this idea that you do minimal intervention to basically make the spaces usable and also find program to start and activate these abandoned spaces. So this is the first floor where we built in this staircase and renovated the first floor to use it also as a studio and archive. But then, I mean, the moment you climb these 199 steps, we also don't have an elevator. So when you literally climb these 199 steps, and this is also something you can see in the film, then you are like there on top of this building, which is kind of like also a rare moment in Berlin. There are not so many moments where you can look around you and see the city from above. Then you basically realize how much work there is. I spoke about the 75%, which seem just like a number, but when you're up there, you realize that there are so many buildings which basically need to be renovated, and there's so much work that needs to be done. When journalists visit us and they are standing up there, I always say, imagine this would be Lakaton Vassal everywhere. We could add these balcony layers everywhere to renovate these housing blocks. But also speaking about the Dong Xuan Center, I think it's important to understand that although we have legislation in place today in the EU that basically would ban single-use plastics, small plastic bags, like this packaging for food, although we kind of like agreed already that we want to transform and shift, this place is still built on it, no? They are selling it every day. So these very big topics that seem so abstract are actually really in front of you, and you are confronted with this reality and ask yourself, okay, what do we have to do so this actually shifts and can change? Which brings us to the next project, and this is kind of like the one project where it's also in the film and the documentary, that's the one project where to us it became clear that we can no longer work with this calculation that I presented before and work with these loopholes in existing legislation, but that we actually have to redesign legislation to make a systemic change. So this project called Mäusebunker or Maisbunker is a former animal testing laboratory in Berlin that is abandoned. We're in the southwest of Berlin and got famous once the interior images were actually published. So the building was built as this testing laboratory. It looks like a bunker, it is a bunker. It's actually completely sealed, so no air can come in and no air can go out because of the tests that happened inside. And there was this famous article in a magazine where actually they published what is happening in there, which led to a huge protest by the people in Berlin who said, okay, this is something we disagree. This is not along our values. We actually don't want this. And this led to the closing of the laboratory, and actually it fell out of use and then sat there abandoned. The building should have been demolished. There was then a protest, and we have here the kind of like different formats, an open letter, an online protest, a petition to save the building for its cultural value, as a brutalist landmark. This was the moment when we as a practice joined in and said, okay, how can we actually save this building from demolition, because it was meant to be demolished and replaced with a new building. And I will show a short video, a film that we did as part of a campaign, a public campaign to tell the story of the building and retell the story, what could happen or how it could be changed.
Es war einmal eine Tierversuchsanstalt, gebaut im Südwesten Berlins als Teil der Charité, geplant als Maschine für Forschung und Experimente, gedacht als Zeichen der Überlegenheit über die Natur. Nichts sollte rein, nichts sollte raus. Ein Bunker inmitten der Stadt. Doch die Menschen wussten, was hinter den Mauern passiert. Sie protestierten für die Schließung des Gebäudes und gegen die Vorstellung, was der Mäusebunker war. Zeugnis der Grausamkeiten von Menschen an Tieren, Zeichen für unendliches Wachstum und Fortschritt, Zweifel an der Abgrenzung zwischen Mensch und Natur. Bis heute steht das Gebäude leer und wartet auf eine Nachnutzung. Und wieder ist es an der Zeit für einen Umbruch, um einen gemeinsamen Raum für unser Zusammenleben zu schaffen. Wir müssen anders auf bereits vorhandene Gebäude schauen, deren Potenzial erkennen, unsere Wertvorstellungen ändern, den Bestand pflegen und weniger neu bauen. Menschen und Tiere müssen am Wandel teilhaben, die Ruine bewahren, die Nutzung adaptieren, die Substanz renovieren, die Regeln transformieren. Mäusebunker, ein Ort des Zusammenlebens.
Okay, it's very nice because this is Alina who spoke the voiceover, so you will hear her later. Okay, so this was like the first clip of 5 short videos we produced. We were invited to the reopening of a big museum, and we said, okay, we will present it there. And in that sense, it was very effective because it led to the point that the city listed the building. So the building won't be demolished. This was very successful. We are very happy and grateful, but nevertheless there's still this question, how can you actually reuse it and activate it? Because in our current system it is basically impossible. I mean, this is something we hear about later in HouseEurope. There is this problem that this building is perceived as a huge risk, and society or the system kind of like says it cannot be reused because of all the risk. Why? Because of course as humans we think we have to use every square meter of this building, no? So you look at the building and you say, okay, it has X square meters, how can we use all of them? And that's then the calculation. In that logic, it cannot be economically viable because it's just not possible. So what we did is we actually used the past of this building, the fact that it was an animal testing laboratory, and we say, okay, what if we give all of those parts that anyways we as humans cannot use, that would be too expensive to renovate and transform, we give it back to non-human. So 44% of the building can be easily renovated and transformed and used by humans, whereas 56% are given to non-humans and are left actually for animals and plants to basically come back in this very robust structure. Which of course comes with this question, what do you preserve? Because this idea that the building is now listed or preserved, there's always the question, do you preserve the image or do you preserve the qualities, the ability of the building, or how do you retell or change the story? So this is kind of like the design that we propose to basically only open the building up and let light in. We then produced, which I think was the most effective part of our contribution, we produced these postcards. There are these holographic postcard that you can flip and then the image changes. So we produced this as a postcard and it was part of the show, but we also sent it to politicians and city officials to kind of like start or make them start thinking that the building could become something else. And that was really the moment when we said, okay, how can we basically change the law to change also our perception of risk that is within existing buildings, which is then the starting point of HouseEurope as an initiative. And we will watch now a short film again, which is a short version of a film that we did that frames kind of like the context, and then Alina will present the initiative.
So the point about land is that it's finite. I think it was one of the Marx brothers who said, we don't make it anymore. So there's a finite amount of land within an international financial system where there's an infinite, almost infinite supply of credit.
So finance is this very powerful force that through its speculative logic is the driving force behind real estate, assigning value through markets onto goods, onto material goods.
I think that's the biggest fraud in the real estate speculation, that you take value that is collectively and historically created by people in the city, then you try to extract it from the very people who created it.
Our everyday lives are now shaped by the priorities of financial markets. Not just real estate actors are seeing our houses as an investment opportunity, but we, everyday people, everyone in society at the moment has an intuitive understanding where they sleep is not just material, it's an asset.
The real tragedy of this conspiracy by speculators, real estate developers, is that they're doing it in secret and we know nothing about it. And so we happily forget about and exclude those speculators and those real estate developers who are planning this moment to destroy the very fabric of our society so that they can make more money. Because if your land is finite, the only way you can keep reinvesting it and keep generating returns is by destroying it and starting again.
Is everything in the city up for demolition? I mean, potentially yes, because if we approach the land and the city through the speculative lens, then of course the biggest increase in value is through this constant demolition and rebuilding.
And it becomes a game of minimizing risks into a broader speculative market in order to attract the right investments that would allow you to survive as a housing association, as a housing structure.
The economics profession are those men are the guilty men. They have driven both the financing of our architecture, of our urban planning, and also, of our residential homes.
We often get the situation where a developer wants us to demolish a building because of their calculations of how much it would cost to demolish and build new versus renovate. If the structure in square meters is anything similar to what would be demolished in the first place, you find that all of the extra cost is actually an estimation of risk that has not been analyzed. We have a whole system that is very comfortable with financing new build because of the guaranteed return on investment.
And if you start in a competition with 10 people, 10 groups, and the developer or the one who, the HouseEurope, doesn't say, listen, you have to use this pre-existing garage or whatever it is to build a tower or to build whatever on top, then you're lost. You're fucked, so to speak, because the developer will always go to the ones that offer more FAR, to generate money.
And we also saw it also hand in hand with what we call build on the build. So it's also tightly connected to what happens to the landscape and to the territory as a whole.
I would go further in this and say no demolition should be allowed, except you prove that nothing can be done. Because in fact, the calculation, you can always make them good. So I think it should be a principle, no demolition, no arrangement.
We all know that together with agriculture, the construction sector is the biggest emitter of CO2. All the buildings that we see around are actually storages of CO2. Once upon a time, a lot of CO2 was emitted in order for these buildings to be built. One of the biggest problems that I see today is that the construction sector is not evolving according to the needs of people.
When a building is demolished, usually what it is replaced with is not to the benefits of the people who were occupying the previous building, which means that by extension, demolition is an antisocial phenomenon.
If I can sum up all the crises with which we are confronted, I would say that the sum of all of them is the fact that we reached the limits of a system. So the main problem is that actually things that have a huge value, they cannot be evaluated. There is no price. They don't have a price.
And the question for me is simple. When you have one, it could mean one flat, one block, one slab. When you have one, you demolish one and you rebuild one. At the end, you have one. If you have one and you just add half of one, and at the end, you have 1.5. You spend less, you have more. No, so it is to think better, to be more intelligent in the way you do, you build, you reuse, you add to existing situations. But this ambition is absolutely necessary, and for social housing or for any housing.
So this is about revolutionizing construction, rethinking entirely how we assemble all these elements, for instance. Are they assembled in a way that they can be disassembled, of course, but also thinking about how a construction detail will be taken care of. Think about a window, for instance. Are you able to clean that window? Are you able to repaint that particular piece of the house, depending on how it's built and things like that? So revolutionizing construction also means by design. What would happen if the entire labor force, which is currently used in new construction, would be rerouted into renovation.
You have plenty of architects that are able to understand the buildings as they are, to see what is missing there, how they repair that, or they transform that, what is the capacity of transformation.
Reinventing our construction industry is never about losing jobs and never about destroying existing trades, but about rerouting them into a virtuous construction industry.
So if we look at the problem of demolishing buildings the other way around and see the keeping of a building being stimulated financially, then, for instance, in Belgium, we do have a difference in VAT. VAT when you renovate is 6%. VAT when you build something new is 21%. So, of course, there is an incentive.
And to be honest, my experience is that a lot of investors and a lot of entrepreneurs really would like to have those incentives, would like to work sustainably. They're like you and me. They too have a conscience, really. And so if we gave them incentives to do the right thing, which is keep this building, make sure that we reuse it effectively and use it for housing, rather than destroying it and giving it as an asset to a global bank.
We can think of solutions that deploy the daringness, the openness, the radicality of speculation with what we already have.
So hello, also from my side, everyone. This film is, so talking about HouseEurope in and of itself, this film is quite interesting to us because we have started working on HouseEurope, or the project in and of itself, which was not called HouseEurope in the very beginning, in 2023, in January. This was a research project and a teaching venture in the very beginning, and I joined that team also from the perspective of a communications person, so not as an architect, so that was a long process of realization and understanding also for me. And HouseEurope, we started for this entire year as a research to understand what does it mean to do actually a European Citizens Initiative as a tool, and I will show you the last film in a minute that describes the ECI as a tool itself. Now it is both a non-profit policy lab and the European Citizens Initiative, and we advocate for new laws to make the renovation and transformation of existing buildings the new norm. And talking about renovation as the best option, first I will actually show you this very brief last film that was also done with the students at ETH, talking about the ECI, and then the narrative that we try to put together in order for this to also reach a broader public.
HouseEurope is an initiative that aims to transform existing buildings for a more social and ecological future. Today, the building industry is responsible for 38% of the global CO2 emissions. Functioning buildings are being demolished and replaced. Demolition is as outdated as food waste, fast fashion, and single-use plastics. So don't demolish, renovate. Renovation is the best option, saving homes, jobs, energy, and history. This is why HouseEurope advocates for new EU laws to make renovation the new norm. We demand tax reductions, a VAT reduction on sustainable renovation work and reused materials, fair rules, focusing on the potentials rather than the risks of existing buildings. New values, a new evaluation criteria for their invested grey energy. The EU has the power to change this and make renovation cheaper, faster, and easier. Support the European Citizens Initiative and help us get to 1 million signatures for HouseEurope.
So a European Citizens Initiative is a tool that was invented by the European Union 12 years ago because they realized the skepticism towards politics and especially towards the EU is so high that they need to somehow change the way direct democracy functions. And there is, coming from the research in Zurich, there is this understanding of petitions and like how people can actually have a stake in democracy and in politics. So you can actually start a European Citizens Initiative with whichever claim you have. The most successful ones were mostly on animal rights, saving bees, and, for example, banning pesticides, right? This is one of the ways you can somehow use this tool. And for us, it was interesting because also, how do you step out of an architecture discourse, an architecture bubble, and try to make people understand that the built environment really has an impact in their daily lives? So in that year in which we were just researching before we were actually setting up the campaign properly, we also did a research, like a study, almost like a market study, with 8,000 people in 8 EU member states. And what was very interesting is that, I mean, there were many interesting things about it, but most people don't actually understand that renovation has anything to do with their lives, I mean, in particular, but also the built environment. It's not something that people usually think about. And so we were looking at what are the narratives and what is the conversation that we need to have in order to like bring this into like a public discourse. So we started with a social premise, which is that renovation saves homes by keeping prices stable, and residents can remain in their homes and are not displaced, and neighborhoods can keep their identity and communities stay alive. This is not always the case, right? There's very detailed conversations on what are renovations, but there is one example, and we started using renovation stories, how we call them, which is, for example, the La Caton Vassal, where residents were actually able to remain in the home whilst the renovation was going on. Then there is an economic premise, which is that renovation saves homes by creating more local work. Small businesses can survive and will not be pushed out by big firms. Markets can thrive on labor rather than materials. And we were thinking about the economic incentives that could also include the 92% of the European architecture practices on offices are actually very small scale, 1 to 5 employee offices. And that would mean if we renovate more, also these people have more work. One of the examples we use here from the Basque architects in French, on the French countryside, is a single family house, and they were collaborating with local workers. And we were thinking of like these examples in particular so that they can also be scalable. It's something that is relatable also for architects. So there's always a narrative that we use in depending on which conversation we have. Are we talking to within the bubble? Are we talking, like at a Canadian Center for Architecture, or are we talking to politicians or people on the street? And then there's an ecological premise, which is that renovation saves energy by keeping what is there. Materials can be sustained and will not be wasted. CO2 emissions and resource extraction can be reduced. And our favorite examples are so in this case, it's the Elephant Architects. Our favorite examples are, so this was a former bank, being converted into housing, and these housing structures are the ones that we think are on a large scale in Europe actually very scalable. And we added to the social, ecologic, economic, which is the definition of sustainability, to which we always add the cultural premise, because that's what we really believe in, changing a narrative. In this case, the premise is that renovation saves history by valuing the existing. Memories can last and are not forgotten, and stories can continue and will inform future generations. And for us, this was also a very big learning curve through this study that we did, that a lot of conservative people, or like having like a very particular idea of like what is heritage, is this like an old building, when does it start to be ugly, that kind of narrative we want to like actually also really tackle. And in this case we were looking at a former wine factory, which also became housing. So this kind of value shift that I'm talking about, our buildings have a lot of values and we need to recognize them and make renovation rewarding. So we looked at these laws and incentives to make renovation the new norm, meaning that this designing a law was a very also hard work for us to see that we need to work with different people, lawyers, understand what is really within the power of the EU. So what we always say is that there are a lot of initiatives, and it was really interesting to talk to people here today and yesterday that on a local, national level, there are initiatives and actually people working on trying to change laws on different levels. In our case, we really needed to look at EU law. For example, tenant rights are not within that law, so we couldn't actually tackle that. We tried to make the legal proposal, which is in the exhibition. There's like kind of 1.5 rooms dedicated just to HouseEurope, so you can actually look at the legal proposal more in detail, and you can ask us later. The 3 pillars that we are using right now in order to change the narrative is we want tax reductions for renovations, we want fair rules to assess the potentials and not only the risks, and new values for the embedded CO2. We can go into detail if you are interested later. But our idea was also that, okay, in this case, this is a fun experiment of like how you can use language in order to maybe see how the design of certain things and how architecting can slightly change as well, like the business of architecture we saw in the beginning. So assessing, surveying, mapping, drafting, sketching, and all of these things are very much related to, I guess, how we structure and like design our lives. Of course, for us, it was very new to look at how to create a campaign, and we realized that that the most important thing is that is the building allies, and that we need to reach out and not only to the people who are already working on it, but kind of like try and understand how the specific moments in time can bring us together. And we launched the initiative like a quote-unquote soft launch in the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. Just a month and a half ago, and we showed the film. We had a conversation about it, and we also talked about the space there. So we always try to like find local narratives, because we realize that this is kind of the most relatable way of getting into conversation with people. So yes, in this case, we also know that that if you can help us and support HouseEurope, this will be a much more interesting conversation. At the moment, one can sign up for the newsletter to follow the initiative, and we're working, for example, on like in all the EU member states, on the campaign, on a design generator, on options that people can actually share and communicate. So this is the boring work behind that will, I guess, in the end, hopefully just be the face of the campaign in the end. And we're looking for donations, of course, to the nonprofit, and most importantly, to raise awareness. So this is the QR code where you can actually come to the website and read in more detail on the initiative. I will leave it there for now. Thank you very much to the CCA.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I know this was focused on Europe, but what is the ratio of renovation to demolition and rebuilding after severe weather events? And I think of all the tornadoes that occur in the Caribbean and the United States, and also monsoons in Asia. So I thought that was interesting. And the second question might be, again, because this is Europe, what is the, how is your reflection affected? I mean, of course, it's very practical by the reconstruction that occurred after the Second World War. I mean, there may be residues. I mean, you said there was also a heritage that you want to demolish. Could you show us some of that heritage that should be demolished?
It's not heritage that we want to demolish, but I mean, as part of... Say it again?
You said there was some heritage you felt should be demolished.
No, not that we felt, but what Alina presented with this study, this is a learning that we have, that there's also a divide in Europe where countries say, okay, there are certain built heritage buildings where they have the feeling that it should be demolished because they want to basically demolish it to also erase a certain past. I think there the big challenge is then how can you actually change the public narrative and make people realize or give them reasons or entry points to accept these buildings that are not necessarily the reason for kind of like maybe a trauma that is shared. Yeah, that's a big task. We spoke about it today a lot in an interview, how you could basically offer people kind of like strategies to accept it and see it in smaller pieces. I mean, I think the point before, I think I cannot. Do you want to add something to this point?
Maybe just in the very beginning when we started working on this, that we had some advisors looking at like, okay, what do we really mean by renovation? And we, of course, like one of the first, like thinking about a campaign also, like what are the big images that you can use, right? And then we were thinking of war, of course, and destruction. And he was like, you know, actually thinking about renovation, you're a pacifist. This is what it means. And I think there's different ways of what we mean by renovation, and just maybe that as an add to that.
And I mean, the first question, I cannot speak about the local context in terms of natural catastrophes, but systemically it's very interesting what you say, because currently we are measuring everything in GDP and growth, but of course in that sense, there is this misunderstanding in the system, because, for instance, in Germany, there was this huge natural catastrophe where a whole valley was flooded after severe rain, and it led to so much destruction and demolition. But on the other side, of course, for the market, it was a great moment because it meant so much investment and work. So this is something that, of course, in a German context, particularly the Green Party addresses, that in our current system, natural catastrophes are actually contributing to economic growth. And this is then very similar to, or this is part of the story why so many buildings are demolished to be replaced, not only or rarely because there should be better buildings, but of course because the new building becomes a new asset that serves the portfolio of these developers or investors. So I think that's really, I think we try to tackle this through our legal proposals, this bigger question, what do we want to incentivize and what do we give a value? But of course there's this basic question behind how do you want to live? Also this idea that we shift the investment from material into labor, because you use the money not to pay for the material, but actually to pay for the labor force to renovate what is already there. There is a bigger systemic discussion behind this.
And maybe one more thing, because I think your question was quite particular. So there is also the something that is already destroyed is something else than what HouseEurope is talking about. So we're talking about trying to keep the buildings that are still there, that are in risk of demolition because of financial speculation. Right? This is a very particular thing that we're talking about.
Good evening. Thank you, Victor Jacquet from Concordia University. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. I knew HouseEurope before, but I'm very happy to see it live. One thing that I would like to ask is, we blame a lot the system in this speech, and I think we kind of forget that the architects were kind of out of the picture for a long time. I worked in politics for a few years, and one of the figures that I never saw were the architects. And I think they they went out of the debate for a long time, and as we always say in political science, you get the politician you deserve, or you get the elected person you vote for, basically. And I think the architects were out of the public debate for a long time. So I'm happy to see that this kind of initiative comes back. But I think we cannot only blame the system. I think the architects themselves are kind of responsible that now the biggest construction are led by engineers and big firms. What do you think about it?
I think that I would completely agree. I mean, this is part of the problem. No, it was tackled. This is like the 10-minute version of the demolition drama. No, there's like half an hour version where this is addressed even more. I totally agree. There was a point when architects also kind of like decided or saw themselves, and this is part of the business of architecture, where we try to trace when was this point when architects decided to focus mainly on form or also design for the 1%, no? This obsession also with very particular typologies and not being the advocate in the public for the built environment, or what Keller Easterling says, how is it possible that the McKinsey consultant is making more decisions on the built environment than us as architects? Or Anna Bogdan, who is an architect and then became a politician, she said she was part of so many meetings in Brussels, where she is based, where actually new policy was debated and the people at the table had no experience, no, in architecture at all. I mean, we once wanted to make a film on architects being politicians, but we didn't do it because we could not find anyone, almost no one. We recently, there was, for instance, one, and then you realize that once they are there, they can change something. There is an Irish architect who was then an MP in the European Parliament, who then led the working group on the new energy efficiency laws, who was really the leading figure, very present also in Ireland, and you have a huge movement against the demolition of buildings because he's a public figure who speaks about it. You have cases in other European countries where there were TV shows, architecture TV shows. In Austria you had like a 3 minutes architecture TV show every week before the main news, where an architect would always say, good, it was called plus minus, like a good example and a bad example, and he would just say single family house, bad example because it's sprawl and you seal land. Instead we build multifamily houses. No, so I mean it's like also are there architects who are able to speak to a public, or are there architects who go into politics and take this role? Very rare cases, but I would completely agree. I think that's also what we try to do. In Germany, what happens is that more and more young architects go into administration and really change something. No? In the bigger cities where a lot of people are retiring, or where a generation of administration is retiring, you have younger generations who also, good friend of mine is in the Senate, he's now responsible for writing the competition briefs, and that's like super interesting because he has very limited possibilities actually, but he's very creative in what he does. No? So he says then this must be a barrier-free, inclusive project, and then he adds or attaches the definition of what it actually means to be inclusive, and so you can be playful and work in the existing and not complain and say we have to wait until everything changes, and it's a lot of fun, you know. Yeah. For us, depends, but yeah.
But maybe I mean there's also the very clear fact that you don't really need to have a particular competence to be a politician. You just need to be on a list, right? You can be from the real estate sector like Trump, or you can be, you know. So and then there is of course I do think that there are, I mean, architects in and of itself. I don't ask everybody we talk to, but in the lobbying side, or how sort of the left would like to call it, advocacy, there is a lot of people who know very much about the built environment, and I guess the question is more about like, okay, the laws that are currently in place do serve the demolition, new construction. Why does it do that? Because of the market logic, and you know, like that kind of like, I mean, that lobbyism or like that. This conversation has been had by many architects. So the question is, how do you change that?
Yeah. Hello. My name is Bogdan, another political scientist here at York University. You mentioned McKinsey, they entered our department at some point, and decided to completely renovate our brutalist building. Now it looks like a bank. And I think it's fascinating what you do as kind of an organized profession, as artisans, but also as workers. And it's great that you have this outlet in the European Union, and I assume sometimes you align, sometimes you do not really align with the higher-ups in Brussels. But my question is about your work with organized professions in manual labor. I've heard from the movie that there is this concern that by turning to renovations, you actually kind of undermining the livelihoods of people who are engaged in, building buildings, so manual workers. And I'm thinking, do you have any good examples of how you as organized profession, architects, have worked with, manual workers, builders, to kind of align them with your vision, given that there is some sort of like a tension, right? If you turn to renovations, people who working in building new buildings can be laid off, let's say. So how do you kind of reconcile that tension between, let's say, you as an organized profession and labor unions?
Yeah, you just mentioned it in the end. I think it's a question with labor unions, definitely, but I think this is a bit of a misunderstanding. And I mean, there are facts that prove basically the opposite, no? I just said this also today. In the morning, I got a coffee and I was walking on the street, and then I was asked to change sites because there's a construction site. So they are building a skyscraper, like a high rise, next to our hotel. And you see the construction site and you see the prefabricated elements arriving, but very little workers in there, no? And this is something that, and I think we should mention this also on a European level, there is actually agreement. There's a program called the Renovation Wave. So this is really like a paper that was published that frames that this is the main goal of the European Union. Then one can say they're maybe not so good in communicating it or reaching the architects or also the workers, but they are already very aware. So they also did studies that every million invested in renovation of existing building creates 16 jobs. Actually, they have the opposite discussion. They are almost afraid that we don't have enough workforce. So in Europe, the discussion is not it would kill jobs on an EU level. Like on a fact-based level, it's rather, will we be able to get enough skilled workers to triple the renovation rate? Also, the president of the Architecture Council says, are the architecture offices out there, and it's like over 600,000 architects now in Europe, are they ready to take 3 times more projects? And so it means, and in the longer version of the film it's explained, it means that of course you have to reroute the industry and you have to transform it, also the architectural practice. In a conversation with Herzog de Meuron, for instance, the way their office is structured, because you're not an architect, it's a very big architecture firm with hundreds of employees, but very hierarchical. So they have very little design leads, and they have then a team, because in big building projects, you design once, and then a lot of people need to work to actually accomplish the building. But if you reverse this and decentralize it, because you have smaller projects, and a lot of them, also these big firms need to completely restructure, because you need more people who take responsibility. And in this renovation and transformation project, things will change. This is why it's actually great for architects, because already now in Germany, we as architects can ask more honorar for a project in an existing building, because of course it's priced in that you will discover things. No, you remove a wall and you find a surprise and you have to adapt. So I mean, it comes with a lot of consequences, but they are actually in favor of the workers and the unions. Also in conversation with the tenant unions, who are also aware that a renovated apartment will be definitely more affordable, definitely, than a new constructed afterwards, no? Because once it's demolished and rebuilt, of course it will be way more expensive. So there are a lot of studies and numbers already out there. So all of these facts are there, but they are not really told or communicated in a way that people say, yeah, it's true, actually it makes sense. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Maurer. I'm a film scholar and architecture historian. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was perhaps not so attentive, but could you tell us more about the films, how you use films, how you make films and use films? Because as I understood, all the films that we've watched here and in the exhibition are made by your students at Station Plus at ETH, or not every film, but could you tell us more how they are spread? Do you use them here within your lecture, within the exhibition? Are you also using them, and how do you use them for your, let's say, campaigns for people? I mean, here you're talking somehow to your peers. We know about all these problems and potentials as well, but as we know how architecture works, we have to talk to people who do not have the same ideas or see not the same possibilities, politicians, investors, etc. So how do your films work within your work?
So the first films, or when you're then in the exhibition, because it's chronologically, let's say in the middle of the show, you see on 3 screens trailers of films that we basically did partially before we started teaching. No, but this was then part of the argument why we also got the chair, which we applied for, no, because this is how the school is structured, that you have these different chairs and you formulate a program, and our program was this idea of broadcasting, getting the message out there like a TV station, no? So this was how we kind of like applied and started out of B+ to do this Station Plus. Then, for instance, the Mäusebunker film you saw, that was done by the office. No, so that's something where the film is a way to tell the story of a design that was not done with the students. The trailer, the yellow trailer in the end, was then again done with the students. That's on the website. This is what we share on social media. So there are different formats. The longer ones we most of the time do ourselves over a longer time, also because the students are not experienced, but these compressed formats we do with the students, so that's like very basic format question. And then they are used to communicate to different people. So I mean, the film you saw, the demolition drama, is the film that speaks to architects, no? There is another film, Power to Renovation. So those who were in Berlin at the assembly, they saw the other film that speaks to non-architects. So there is not the argument of square meters, competition, handmade to capitalism. It has different arguments. It focuses on the loss of homes, communities, stories. So different interviews cut together differently. And now we decided that the films will be online from 1st of February to just raise awareness for the cause. So it's then just out there. Yeah, this is what but all the films in general are always on our website and used to communicate. So it's really this communication tool in different lengths and in different formats.
Thank you. Mutawakil from the CCA. I'm an architect, a non-builder architect. Thank you for tonight. And I have maybe the last question is about more about architectural schools in Europe. And I know that you said that you were a teacher. And how do you have plan or programs? Because now I know that in architecture schools, it's more about like creating ex nihilo from nothing, and we have all these models, and renovating is really like it comes very late in the courses and it's not very well seen. What are you planning to work with architecture schools, or maybe having link between political schools and architecture schools, because it's maybe also like relations that doesn't exist really now, and do you plan on working on this too?
Yeah, it's a super important point. Actually, something that I would almost like to link to the previous question, because of course an architecture school or like is a little bit of a almost like a safe environment where you can have a little bit of a playground of like this trial and error, have a little bit of doubt, and you know, for example, these films. This is why I mean the conversation earlier, like about the demolition drama and the renovation, like we make changes, we look at like what works and what doesn't work. So this is like actually a really wonderful place from which to start actually creating. But in the sense of HouseEurope itself, so the conversation on renovation and demolition has been taken on by the entire school at ETH for the master topics. And this was not like just done like that. This is also a longer conversation, and we had to like kind of like push for that, so that the other chairs, and there's how many, 26 or something, chairs in the entire architecture department, and they all took it on. So now we're doing an exhibition in this semester with all of the chairs in the foyer of the building, and everyone looks at potential options on how to house Europe within the existing. So it also is really interesting that even people who didn't necessarily want to take it on in the very first instance are like, okay, well, there is a potential. Every architect can work with the existing. Why don't we look at potential options and like solutions? And maybe one more, which is in that study that we did, it showed that the young people between 18 and 25 were the people who were least interested in renovation and in the built environment. They were like, we don't care. It's not only that we don't even see how this affects our lives. We don't care. We don't want to see it. But of course, it didn't regard, because it was like the social demographic was very, it was very well done by that agency that helped us. But of course, it didn't really like represent architecture students, because architecture students are really interested in this. And we also understood that through collaborating with different universities in with HouseEurope, we built like really large alliances through entire Europe, and there is actually several universities that are tackling renovation and demolition at the moment.
Yeah, maybe just adding to this. Yes, so there were several schools who then said, okay, we are interested. They just reached out, and we kind of like shared the material, and they came up with ideas that make sense in the local context. I think it's what Alina said before, that when you tie it to a local example, because a building is meant to be demolished, and you make a proposal how to reuse it, or I mean, the Italian case, this was, I think, a very fascinating studio. In Italy, you have a lot of bonuses for existing buildings. Now you can apply for renovation bonuses for roofs, windows, facades, etc. The university made a catalog of all these bonuses to see these incentives, and then they said to the student, you are only allowed to do a design using all of these bonuses, and therefore the money that the client would normally spend is in that sense yours. So, you know, it's a very playful way, and I think that all of the universities from Politecnico, or like from Milan, Genova, Berlin, Vienna, Innsbruck, Amsterdam, that we now have these studios, but it's not that we have them, not they do this, just like they say they're interested. That's all connecting. I think what connects them all is then you're back at this 38% in the beginning, a kind of like productive resistance by the students to continue the way we are taught until now, that you get I don't say that's now exaggerated, but you get a blank piece of paper and it's like design a building. No, I think their students say, or even this idea, let's imagine this building is demolished and we build a new museum. Students say, well, why should we imagine this? You know, it's like there's enough work to be done. I think that can become very productive. I'm also just coming from a symposium that was only on this topic, repairing architecture schools, where actually all these professors from different schools were asking this question, how can we bring it in the curriculum to make it a mandatory thing? Because then if you look at Italy, 84% are in existing, but in the curriculum it's basically almost not present. No, so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and then the architecture students will also educate in that sense the practice, no? Which we experience right now at ETH.
Thank you again for this fantastic presentation.